Welcome, Age of Vintage Society. For a good portion of the 20th century, actor James Maitland Jimmy Stewart was one of Hollywood's most popular leading men. Root around the history of Hollywood and you won't find many two stars with a cleaner, more wholesome reputation than Jimmy Stewart. His boyish charm, effortless relatable poise and sheer talent will be forever ingrained in Hollywood's past. How Jimmy Stewart was forced to become a man by Louis B. Mayer. Make sure to watch the video until the end and leave your thoughts in the comments. If you are new here, join our wonderful community by subscribing to the Age of Vintage channel. Jimmy Stewart, the Hollywood Everyman. He won over America and the world with his small-town boy-made-good charm. There are legends of Hollywood's golden age, and then there's the actor professionally known as James Stewart, who everybody just called Jimmy. Why? Because Jimmy Stewart was just that much of a likeable, everyday kind of a guy. Millions of movie fans still see something of themselves in Stewart's characters, who more often than not are regular people facing powerful villains, steep odds and tight situations. Despite these trials, they remain dreamers who stay true to themselves and win in the end. Stewart's characteristic charm and gumption helped make classics out of films like It's a Wonderful Life, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Harvey, The Philadelphia Story, Rear Window, Vertigo, and many, many more. James Jimmy Stewart was an unlikely candidate for silver screen fame, lacking the suave handsomeness and virility of a Cary Grant, the tough masculinity of a John Wayne, and the dark grit of a Humphrey Bogart. He was unlike anything else to come out of Hollywood at the time. Beanpole thin, with a famously slow drawl and awkward mannerisms, studios initially couldn't imagine him as a leading man. Everyone could sense that Stewart was enormously talented, but few had a clue on how to use him. It would take directors like Frank Capra and Alfred Hitchcock to recognise his strengths: openness, emotional complexity, intelligence and authenticity, and coax out some of cinema's most unforgettable performances. He was well known for being modest, quiet and shy, both on and off the camera. The actor was notoriously guarded about his emotions both in public and private, and he kept only a very few close friends throughout his entire life. As director John Ford once complained, "You don't get to know Jimmy Stewart. Jimmy Stewart gets to know you." He was the movie's quintessential everyman, a uniquely all-American performer who parlayed his easygoing persona into one of the most successful and enduring careers in film history. Believe it or not, this towering figure of American pop culture had an off-screen existence just as colourful and dramatic as the lives of the characters he so honestly and earnestly portrayed. In the 81 films made throughout his nearly 50-year career, Jimmy Stewart often played a man of modest means, striving to overcome his situation to reach his dreams. He is probably best remembered for his role in the 1946 sentimental holiday favourite, It's a Wonderful Life, in which he plays the embittered idealist, a decent small-town citizen, George Bailey. With a career that was decades long and a list of films under his belt that would make any cinephile drool, Stewart is one of the greatest of all time. But what happened in front of the camera was barely half the story. There was much more to Jimmy than his roles in famous films. The man was multi-talented, brave and dedicated to his country. James Maitland Stewart was born in Indiana, Pennsylvania on May 20, 1908. The son of Elizabeth and Alexander Stewart, James Stewart has come a long way since his boyhood days in Pennsylvania. Stewart's mother had attended college, which was unusual for a woman of her generation, and his father was a Princeton graduate who had returned home to run the prosperous family hardware store founded in 1853. Growing up in a small town with his two sisters, Virginia and Mary, instilled values that he would carry with him throughout his life. Stewart had an artistic bent, with an interest in music, and earned his way into his father's alma mater, Princeton University. There he received a degree in architecture in 1932. Starting out as an amateur magician and accordionist, he made his acting debut in a Boy Scout play and later performed in shows for the Princeton Triangle Club. Stewart was a lanky boy. He would grow 6 foot 3.5 inches tall, and he enjoyed playing the accordion and putting on plays he wrote himself. But pursuing that career seemed tenuous, as the country was in the midst of the Great Depression. Instead, Stewart decided to follow his interest in acting, joining a theatre group in Falmouth, Massachusetts, after graduating and rooming with fellow aspiring actor Henry Fonda. They would become lifelong friends, even though they had differing views on many subjects. They stayed close by agreeing never to discuss politics. It was here he befriended future stars like Fonda and Margaret Sullivan. Years later, Sullivan would prove to be instrumental to Stewart's career by insisting that he be given parts in her films. In the years since his motion picture debut, James Stewart has earned a place in the hearts of movie-going audiences as one of Hollywood's best-loved actors. His laconic style and boyish manner seem the embodiment of an uncomplicated honesty that also marked the career of his longtime friend Henry Fonda. Both men came to exemplify a uniquely American style of acting that takes simplicity and directness as its foundation. Due to the Depression, Stewart thought there would not be many jobs available, so he took up an offer from a friend. He spent the next summer preparing a show for Broadway with the Falmouth Players. When the show headed to New York, Jimmy followed suit. He was enamoured with it all. He started on Broadway with bit parts, moved to small parts, and those led to leading roles, until he was discovered by Hollywood. In 1935, Stewart signed a contract with MGM Studios and began his impressive film career. During the 1930s, he made 21 feature films and continued to hone his acting skills. He starred in films with Spencer Tracy, Ginger Rogers, Marlene Dietrich, Clark Gable, Jean Harlow, Joan Crawford, Margaret Sullivan, and Edward G. Robinson. MGM cast him in musicals, dramas, comedies, and westerns. Stewart, who so often seemed the very soul of small-town America in his film roles, was forced to visit a brothel by his studio, MGM, to make a man of him. The notoriously tyrannical MGM boss Louis B. Mayer was so concerned about the young Stewart's apparent lack of interest in ladies, he forced him to visit a brothel so people wouldn't start gossiping that he was a homosexual. It was an era of American Puritanism when actors and their reputations were effectively owned by the studios that held their contracts, and subject to extraordinary manipulations. Stewart, of course, was not homosexual or even bisexual. He lost his virginity to Ginger Rogers when he was in his 20s. As his career progressed, he had affairs with Loretta Young and Marlene Dietrich, before settling down at 40 with divorced socialite Gloria McLean, with whom he lived happily ever after. But when he was 25, his very blamelessness was cause for concern. "I had to lay down the law to him," an MGM scout called Bill Grady told Elliot. "I had to tell him, Jim, if you don't go and give a manly account of yourself at least a few times, Mayer and the others will think you're homosexual." Mayer owned a private brothel just off the MGM lot, creating a discreet locale where the talent could misbehave in the secure knowledge that word would not reach the gossip columnists and entertainment magazines. Grady told Stewart, "Get your ass over there and get those rocks off with at least 2 of those broads." Stewart reluctantly did. This was the 1930s, and Hollywood stars had reputations to maintain, for financial reasons under the studio system as well as moral ones. If they were exposed as homosexuals or deviants, or ran foul of the law, it spelt trouble at the box office and frequently ended careers. The studio's monitoring and regulatory measures, including morals clauses in contracts, was essentially an economic rather than a moral directive, Elliot said. The studios did what they had to do to insure their stars, and in many cases that meant more than taking out life insurance policies. Stewart's early screen appearances often found him playing rapidly forgettable callow youths. It was director Frank Capra who first recognised his special blend of bashful humour and underlying strength, and put it to use in several films that cast Stewart as the personification of American idealism. Capra's populist comedies, including You Can't Take It With You, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and It's a Wonderful Life, conveyed the director's belief in the fundamental decency of the common man, and Stewart's skill at combining warmth, humour and pathos in his performances made him the perfect Capra hero. George Cukor's The Philadelphia Story demonstrated his flair for sophisticated comedy alongside Katharine Hepburn and Cary Grant. Stewart was riding high, and MGM was expecting big things from him. What he chose to do next was bigger than anyone could have imagined. Like his ancestors before him, Stewart enlisted in the United States Army to the dismay of MGM. He was actually the very first American movie star to enlist in the Army for World War II. The Stewart family tradition of serving in the military goes back to Jimmy's third great-grandfather, Fergus Moorhead, who served in the Revolutionary War. Jimmy's maternal grandfather was a general for the Union in the Civil War. His father Alex served in both the Spanish-American War and World War I. Jimmy Stewart entered the Army as a private, and at the end of World War II was a colonel in the Army Air Corps. Fully decorated as the result of the 20 combat missions, he flew over Germany as leader of a squadron of B-24s. Among the medals he was awarded were 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses and the Croix de Guerre. Stewart continued his military career after World War II by serving in the Air Force Reserves, and rose to the rank of Brigadier General. President Reagan awarded him the Medal of Freedom, which is the highest award that can be awarded to a civilian in the United States. Following the war, Jimmy got right back to the business of making movies. His first post-war performance in the movie, It's a Wonderful Life, earned him an Academy Award nomination. Initially, this film was a box office bust. It has become the most famous Christmas holiday film in Hollywood history. He gives a moving performance as a man on the verge of suicide, whose faith in humanity is restored by a visit from a guardian angel. If Stewart broke the mould of the typical leading man, his behaviour off the set was equally antithetical to the rest of Hollywood. Never one to be flashy, married only once, courteous to everyone he met, disciplined and professional, his life provided little grist for the town's gossip columns. There were no shortage of people who agreed with President Truman when he said, "If Bess and I had a son, we'd want him to be just like Jimmy Stewart." While we often think of the stars of yesteryear as more upright than the current crop of tabloid fodder, the Hollywood of the past was much like it is today. Studios just worked harder to cover up their actors' misbehaviour, and the media kept a respectful distance. While Jimmy Stewart was assuredly no saint, next to fellow actors who juggled multiple women at a time, had affairs with married women while they were single, and liaisons with single women when they were married, Stewart was considered downright prudish. He preferred to keep his relationships out of the public eye, and was notoriously circumspect about the women in his life when probed by reporters. While other stars burned through multiple marriages, Clark Gable and Cary Grant both married 5 times, Stewart held out to find the right woman to settle down with. She was hard to find in Hollywood. Women threw themselves at Stewart in hopes of hitching their star to his, but he found these brash, sexually aggressive women off-putting, and quickly tired of the vapid ladies he met in Tinseltown. Seeing many of the women he knew cheat on their husbands, he became extremely cautious about tying the knot. As his 40th birthday approached, he began to despair of being a bachelor forever. But then he met Gloria Hattrick. Athletic, smart and funny, she was an elegant and beautiful woman who shared his love of fishing, golfing and sailing. Stewart and Hattrick were married in 1949 and stayed married for 45 happy years. If Stewart had been something of a playboy in his single years, after his trip down the altar he became a devoted husband. Stewart's success continued into the 1960s and 70s. Stewart's long career was certainly one of Hollywood's most rewarding, and the actor's occasional interviews and television appearances only strengthened the warm regard in which he was held. With the continuing popularity of many of his best films, he remains a much-loved and much-admired figure in American cinema. Stewart went into semi-retirement when health began to fail him. He retired permanently from public life after his beloved wife of 45 years passed away. He died on July 2, 1997. He will be remembered as a talented actor, brave military hero, loving husband, good father, and a giant among men. He leaves a legacy of honesty, hard work, and strong values. He was a good man, a loyal citizen, and had a wonderful life. He indeed earned his wings. If you liked this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you are new here, and if you want to support my work, please visit my Patreon page. Now it is your turn. What do you think about the life and legacy of James Stewart? He was good-looking without being handsome, quiet without being a bore, ambitious without taking either himself or his job too seriously, and unassuming without being dull.